Okay, yeah. So like Drew just said, I'm going to talk a little bit about two games, both from Ndemic, Plague Inc. and Reveling. And to get there, I'm actually going to do a little bit of backdrop that I think is necessary to understand these works. And I call this talk "The Map is Not the Territory," because I want to talk a little bit about simulation. A technique that's used a lot, I think, especially in Games for Change, trying to sort of simulate a system that we see in the world around us so we can think about what that system's effects are or how it could change, how it's impacting people. And both of the systems in these games, the Ndemic games, are very much about life and death in very different ways. But they are, just like every simulation in a game, an abstraction, just like a map is, right? And of course, that's what makes a map useful, is that it's not exactly the same as the territory it represents. Because to do that, it would have to be as large as the entire territory. It would be very hard to fold up and carry around with you. So a map only points out certain things, right? It points out things that for the purpose of that particular kind of map are important. So there are decisions to be made, whether you're abstracting into a map or a simulation or anything about like, okay, what are you going to spotlight? What are you going to leave out? So I want to talk a little bit about that. And to get there first, I want to say happy Juneteenth. That's today. It is the anniversary of, are my notifications showing up? Good, they're not. The Sharon just tweeted about it, and it popped up on my iPad, and I was afraid it was showing up there. But so this is the anniversary of the day that the news of the Emancipation Proclamation was actually spread to the South. And it was 2 years after the Emancipation Proclamation was signed, which also points out that even if some sort of change is made legally, officially, how we actually communicate about that is incredibly important, because until 2 years later, the people who were living under slavery, slaves in the South and people living in the slave system, didn't even know, right? So how we communicate and present this information is incredibly important. This continues to be a big challenge in games about slavery. I'll just point out, like, is related to Segway. So like these two games, both were criticized in different ways for trying to simulate slavery, but like really missing out on certain aspects, right? So Flight to Freedom on the left, the educational game, that was roundly criticized several years back for presenting the experience of being a young slave through the game mechanics of a choice adventure, right? And so the issue here was, well, there were right choices and wrong choices, and how are you sort of simulating like what actually is the correct thing to do if you are a young slave trying to escape? And what's left out of this picture? I think one of the things was mentioned especially for that was the absence of any discussion of complicity from or benefit to the white slaveholders. Freedom of the Underground Railroad is a more recent game, a board game that takes a different tack, right? So in this game, you're not a slave trying to escape. You're taking the role of abolitionists trying to fight against slavery. And the little brown cubes that you see in the sort of lower part of that board represent some abstracted quantity of slaves whose lives you can save by moving them from the south to the north, but more of them are coming over on the triangle trade across the Atlantic on ships. And so some quantity of them tend to die, and that's part of the sort of the tragic feeling of this game. But again, it was criticized for sort of abstracting real human lives into little cubes, right? So they're sort of at opposite ends of abstraction in some ways. But both criticized for trying to simulate and like not like quite making it there. So then you have even more recent examples like This Guilty Land. There aren't too many good pictures of this game, but it's a new one where it's trying to take a completely different approach, not simulate at the level of what's going on for slaves, but looking at, was the Civil War inevitable as a result of the system of slavery, and how did that play out in politics in the United States? So that's slavery, very difficult topic to simulate. And we're going to be looking at some more difficult topics, but we'll start with a slightly easier one. Simulating a city, really classic, right? SimCity, been around for a long time. The very first versions of SimCity, it's been pointed out, focus a lot on water management and have no public transit. In part because it's a simulation really of Southern California, right? Which is where Will Wright was designing the game. This is the 2014 version of SimCity, which was designed by Stone Librandi. And he made a number of really interesting decisions in this game. One was, so he was going to include public transit. He was trying to do a lot of research to drive how he was doing the simulation in this game. But at the urging of his wife, he included like more like green options, sort of environmentally sustainable stuff, even though he wasn't really sure whether he ought to be warranting like how effective these were by representing them as having positive effects in the game. One thing that he chose to do that ended up being controversial. So does anyone know what all these little yellow figures are? These are homeless people in SimCity. So many cities in this version of SimCity end up with like this kind of quantity of homeless people in this simulation because when Stone Liberandy was doing the research, he found like, okay, there's really no credible thing I could present as the solution that just reduces homelessness. So if I was going to point out any particular way of doing, rehousing, low-income housing, mixed-income housing, housing made out of recycled containers. Like none of those things, like he wasn't able to find enough research that suggested, yes, this is the silver bullet that will solve it, or even maybe a partial silver bullet. So he actually left that out. He was like, look, there are homeless people that appear. There's no way for you to just buy a certain thing in the system and get rid of them. So SimCity 2014 cities will often end up looking like this, unless they stay very small. So this to me is a really interesting example of something that's left unsimulated, right? Something where there's like a hole in the middle of the simulation. It's saying like, we're not dealing with that. We're not going to tell you, we're not going to even give you any avenues to try and solve this, which is different than the real world, right? Because of course people in the real world try all sorts of different things. But I think this is the donut hole of simulations. There's a gap somewhere in the middle that really proves to be somewhat defining as to sort of what the simulation is about, right? It's the missing piece, the thing that's like at that would close the circuit if it was there, but instead there's like a little electricity arcing across that gap, right? So in this case, the hole is that there's no credible solution to homelessness. And that was based on Stone's research. But of course, it's a particular stance that he's taking. He's like, look, I can't find anything that suggests that any of these things is good enough, so I'm not going to put any of them in. I'm not going to put a partial solution in. That was his approach, and it's a very particular stance to make. And a lot of people notice it. They think it's a bug. They report it as a bug, and EA is like, no, that's there on purpose, right? So here's another example: prison simulator. This is our prison architect. Sorry. So this game from a British company, Introversion, was attempted to be very, very detailed simulation of what it's like to manage a prison as a warden. Sort of really getting into a lot of the problems and injustices, all sorts of things. But there was one thing that they deliberately that people noticed that they didn't include. They're like, oh, we have these inmates of different skin colors, but the skin colors of the inmates here, what they look like in these little abstracted versions, have no effect on gameplay whatsoever. And people pointed out, like, well, that is very different from other depictions of prison and incarcerated populations that we've seen in different places in movies, TV. Oz, Orange is the New Black, whatever, right? That like doesn't race play a huge role, and indeed, if you sort of look at research and statistics and experiential accounts of incarcerated life, it's true. And but they were like, look, we did not know how to simulate that. We were like not prepared to try and say, here are the rules. We could boil down to some rules about how people are racist to each other in prison, or maybe they're not racist, but they're like, I had better try to join up with these white supremacists because they're the other white people here, and otherwise I'll get beaten up, right? Or something like that. Like, how do you model those kinds of decisions? They said, like, look, we can't do it, in part because a lot of that kind of dynamic is happening in, say, the prison population in the United States, which is very different than in the UK, where they were simulating it. So they left that out. So this idea that there are huge racial tensions in incarcerated life is just left unsimulated. So it's this sort of haunting the system, right? There's this thing that you feel or that you've been taught should be going on here, or that you understand from other accounts, but that's not there in the system. Another famous case, Spent. In Spent is an attempt to simulate life on the margins of poverty, trying to find a place to live on a very limited budget and making lots of sacrifices. And this game was studied by a psychology student who discovered that it actually decreased people's attitudes and empathy towards people in poverty. And why did it do that? Well, there were a bunch of different theories, but you could say one reason is because people felt like they could solve this simulation. They could sort of find the correct way to balance their budget and be like, well, I never spend anything on birthday presents. That's just stupid, right? And so I was able to figure out how to live. Therefore, it's not really that hard. If you just get good at it, well, what's wrong with these people who can't figure out how to win poverty? And of course, it's not simulating certain things, right? You can't simulate in this type of simple experience the psychological and experiential dimension of actually struggling through poverty and like what that would be like and how would it affect your decision making, and or make you have to weigh these things that are really strongly affecting you in your actual life emotionally, right? So again, there's something sort of missing there that really is defining the experience to the extent that we can measure it psychologically in people's attitudes and how it sort of changes how they think negatively, in this case, about poor people. So that takes me to Plague Inc. So this is the main screen of Plague. It is, in fact, a map. It's a map of the world, right? And this is a game by Ndemic, and James will be joining us to talk about it later. It was their huge, big breakout hit, I guess you could say. Yeah, James is nodding, so it's an apt term, I guess. And in this game, in case you're not familiar with it, your job is to kill all of humanity. And you do that because you are playing the role of a disease that is, in this case, guided by you, a human intelligence, in ways that diseases, thankfully, are not generally guided. And to try and see, can you make a disease that's lethal and transmissible enough to kill everybody? So this kind of joins what I think of as a subgenre of games, many of them games for change, in which you play the bad guy, right? And so this has a long history in entertainment games, games like Overlord and Dungeon Keeper, right? Where you play a bad guy, you're sort of fighting the good guys. And in games for change, there's quite a long history of this sort of thing too, right? Even games like Ian Bogos's Killer Flu, which is about disease transmission. You play a disease, so you're trying to spread itself, or Paolo Pedercini's Oligarchy, where it sort of exposes the logic of exploitation and capitalism sort of as an oil company, and so on and so forth, many examples. But I think the interesting difference here, the games on the left, these are all games for change or impact games, right? Sorry, my font's got a little thrown off by this format switch, but Plague Inc. was not designed originally to be like, okay, we want to teach people explicitly. We're trying to convey something about how diseases are transmitted. That makes it different than Killer Flu. Plague Inc. was inspired by a web game that, again, took this sort of bad guy approach, like where you play a disease called Pandemic, and then sort of adapted and improved that and sort of made it much more accessible and sophisticated for the mobile audience. And then so eventually Plague Inc. evolved as the version you're seeing here, so the most recent version. So it's always interesting, I think, in the context of this conference to look at how different approaches to subject matter leads to slightly different effects in terms of how people are reached, who a game is accessible to, how the message comes across, and the role of fiction in the game as well. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Plague before I move on to showing you how Rebel Inc. works. So in Plague Inc., you can pick what type of disease you want to be. The first 5 types or so are all sort of real-world examples of diseases, all the way down to like prions, like mad cow disease. And then from there on out, there are several more that are not on the screen. Things get a little bit more sci-fi. But what's interesting is that the groundwork for how diseases work is in this game are sort of laid down by the initial sort of real-world types of diseases. How are they transmitted? How can they survive? How fast do they mutate? All of these kinds of things. And then that actually provides a lot of structure for the science fiction-y plagues to have those same kinds of dimensions and properties, right? That they're like, okay, well, a nanovirus is kind of like a virus, but it works slightly differently, and people become aware of it in a very different way, and so on and so forth, because even though that's not a real-life scenario. And for me, this kind of goes hand in hand with some findings, actually notably done for about another disease transmission game, Pox, up at Dartmouth, where Pox, they made a version of it that was about vaccination in populations, that was just told players, like, this is about disease transmission. And then they made a zombie version, right? And Plague Inc. also has a zombie mode as well. And the zombie version was demonstrably and measurably much more effective at getting people to retain and learn information about how vaccination works. So I think it's notable that, although not driven by like, let's do research on effective, measurable outcomes for a funder, right? Plague Inc. also, has, out of the, we'll ask James about this later, out of the desire to sort of spread itself, right? Become like interesting, entertaining, activate people's imaginative circuitry, right? To think about like, well, what would it be like if there was a zombie plague, right? It's kind of based on what our understanding is about disease. But it actually maybe does a better job than a lot of deliberate games, deliberate impact games, at sort of spreading and getting across these ideas. And James has been invited to speak about the models in Plague Inc. at the CDC, for instance. So there's something to that combination, right? Making something that's widely appealing, but that also is grounded in trying to model and simulate the way things work in life. So there are a bunch of different screens. This is sort of the heart of decision-making in Plague, where you can upgrade your virus. As you play, you get DNA points, which you can spend to give your disease horrible symptoms, like bursting cysts, or give people pulmonary fibrosis, or make them go insane when they contract your disease. And then the other really big facet is how easily does your disease transmit itself? So is it spread through the air? Is it airborne, or is it through contaminated water or blood or vectors like rodents? How is it hardy versus heat and cold and things like that? And so here's the basic how the game works flowchart. So you get these DNA points. This is the slightly not exactly realistic part of the game, right? That there are, actual diseases don't earn DNA points by killing people, thankfully. And also are not guided by human intelligence. But the DNA points let you unlock these different kinds of things, making your disease more lethal or giving it more severe symptoms. And then the more you infect human beings and the more severe symptoms they have and the more they kill people, the more DNA points you get. So the basic economic form here is of a snowball, right? It gets bigger and bigger. But the game is interesting because it's more complex than that, right? So if you kill all the humans, you win. But the counterbalancing force is that at some point, based on the severity and lethality, your disease will get noticed by human beings, right? And that's also affected by, this is the most games are changing part, the most games are changing screen in Plague, where the difficulty gets harder if people wash their hands more. Right, and maybe if you don't give sick people hugs, but it goes all the way up to the very brutal difficulty, right, which is not something that a serious game for change, you being observed by a funder might go and say like, well, I think it's really difficult. The real way to resist diseases is to make doctors work 24/7 and to lock up sick people, right? That's, of course, it's not something that anyone would like truly want to advocate for, but in this system, you can point out like, well, yes, if you sort of turn certain dials up to the extreme, a sort of totalitarian system of disease regulation, you could make it very, very hard for the disease. So if the humans notice you, then they can start researching a cure, which would cause you to lose. And then there are more interactions between these systems, right? So certain types of symptoms can slow down research, and the humans can stop your transmission. So there's a basic strategy here of like you could try and make a stealthy disease that's like the common cold, doesn't have like too many bad symptoms, but spreads everywhere, and then mutate it into a horrible thing that gives you like boils and causes all of your flesh to fall off and kills people, right? But the folks at Ndemic have been working on Plague Inc. long enough that the various types of scenarios, the other types of diseases, make this simple strategy much more difficult, and that's where a lot of the interest in the games comes from. So the last screen I want to tell you about, this is the screen that actually lets you take defensive measures against what the humans are trying to do, make the disease harder to research, or more resistant to different temperatures, or resistant to medicines, right? So once the humans start fighting back, abilities on this screen will help your disease survive. But at this point, you might be wondering, well, so what's the hole in the middle here, actually? Like, what's the thing that's not being simulated? And it's tricky in this case because what's being simulated is, of course, it's epidemiology in general. And the thing that I find really interesting that's not part of this, that's sort of not asked by this game is, well, who are you exactly? Are you the disease? Why does this disease have a brain? Right? Has it evolved intelligence to try and hunt down humans? Well, not really. Like, that's outside of the game, right? That's like the premise of the game is that you, a human player, are for some reason, you're like, for fun, for kicks, allying yourself with a humanity-eradicating disease. But it does ask this interesting questions. why do all these horrifying diseases, flesh-eating bacteria and the bubonic plague and smallpox and all these things that we've been terrified of for many, many hundreds of thousands of years? Why do they have these particular symptoms and methods of transmission that make them so fearsome? And through playing the game, you can sort of realize, oh wait, all the other diseases that probably did mutate and evolve, they just didn't really survive. Those were all games of Plague Inc. that just lost because they're sort of doing a random walk through all of the different possibilities. And so we know about smallpox because, oh, that one happened to make this particular set of evolutions that made it really terrifying for us. And other types of diseases, they evolved their lethality too high. They killed all of their hosts, and they didn't really spread, right? And so they were actually not as terrifying. So it's actually, provides you with this slightly disturbing insight into oh, it's a little bit, we have these diseases that are randomly evolved, and we know about them because they're the scary ones, right? It's a little bit like the intelligent life hypothesis, right? Maybe it could have started on many, many different places throughout the universe, but we happen to be on this one, and it's because that's how we know about us, right? So with that, I want to switch over to show you a little bit of Reveling. So this is Reveling, and so you can see we're already in a very different kind of space. The logo is not a biohazard symbol. Now we've got sort of a half of an olive branch, or this is one whole olive branch, I guess, crossed with a scimitar. Reveling. You might think that, like Plague Inc., you're playing the rebels, but that's not the case. The rebels are on the other side. You are in the role of a government that is having to decide what to fund in an area of the world, a nation that you have just destroyed, right? So you have proverbially bombed a country back to the Stone Age. And my interpretation, along with other people's, is that this is roughly a simulation of Afghanistan. Which famously the Bush administration was like, we're going to bomb them back to the Stone Age. And so the question is then well, what do you do next if you inherit this situation and you are like Barack Obama or somebody who's put in charge of trying to help an area that's been heavily bombed or torn apart recover and maybe win hearts and minds, but also sort of deal with problems that are going on. You can't just pull out completely. That would be really irresponsible, right? That's I would say is maybe the basic premise here. So you have a bunch of different maps in this game. I'll play on this mountain map. And this is kind of the equivalent. The maps and the people who are in charge of the area are the equivalent of picking a disease in Reveling. So for governor, I'll just go with sort of basic. And here, again, there are difficulty modes, like in Plague, but much more serious this time around. It's not so much about do you give sick people hugs? But now the things that are causing you problems here are not human beings and hygiene. The problems for your administration trying to sort of rebuild this war-torn area, I'm getting notifications, it's terrible, is that the locals are not necessarily friendly to you. They start off not being supportive of your administration, sort of coming in and occupying the country. And the more money you pour into the country, the more there's a risk of corruption and graft, sort of sapping that money and causing problems and causing local people to think you're just making things worse by pouring money into this country without being responsible about it. And then there are armed insurgents who are actively resisting your occupying force with their own force. So I'll pick normal. There are a couple other things that's going to give you bonuses. And this is a very good part. You can randomize an operation name. So Western, Badger. There, okay. So Operation Western Badger. Right, so the invasion is just ended when you start this game. And the army has been withdrawn for the most part. So it's your job to stabilize this area. So rather than killing everyone, you need to stabilize the region by having enough people that are supportive of your occupying force or supportive of the new regime that you're installing. And let's see, so I have to pick a headquarters. I'll ask James whether this is a good idea, but on this map, I'll start in this path so I can go to either side of the map easily. And so I'm going to pause the game real quickly, but rather than picking various types of mutations for your DNA, you're choosing what to pour money into. So the basic idea, what I understand to be the most important, is to try and fund various types of initiatives like medical supplies, which then let you sort of fund healthcare, getting the school system back on its feet, or actually providing clean drinking water throughout the country, and you can upgrade these. So like you can provide basic sanitation if you want to, right? So, and then the infrastructure, like getting roads and things like that back up. But then there's also some governance options, right? So you could actually have representatives of your government go out and work with community leaders in various areas. Okay, that's a little more expensive. So I'm already spending a bunch of money. You see at the bottom of the screen, inflation is going up, which makes every dollar go a little bit less far as you spend more money, and the risk of corruption is rising as well. Yeah, I'm going to put by one more thing over here, try and increase the efficiency of rolling out these initiatives. And then you can see there's some interesting things, like you can pledge to hold everyone accountable for the actions, no matter how powerful they are. You can make these pledges, which will then have consequences for you later on if you let certain people, like even insurgent leaders or foreign governments, sort of get away with things. You can bring in global charities and NGOs, which actually rather differently than the message of some Games for Change, that actually increases some risk of corruption if you bring NGOs in. So I don't necessarily recommend putting that in your simulation. If you have foundations and NGOs funding you who might take offense, but that's one of the advantages of being an independent company like Ndemic, is you can sort of look at parts of simulation that might make some people unhappy. So there are a lot of options here as well. And then rather than the defensive options that are available in Plague to keep the humans from researching your disease, you have a military set of initiatives in the third tab, but those are not open at the start of the game. So if I fast forward, then it's warning me about inflation, got to stabilize the whole region. All of these little hammers are my initiatives, like, getting the school system back up. And water has been restored to that area, right? And so it takes a while for them to spread around. And if I want to maybe spend some more money, and it's like, I really got to get the roads back up and running. And if I don't work on smaller roads, then I'll never get into those mountainous areas. So I can roll out some more operations like that. And at the end of the first year is when the real problems begin, because the insurgents show up. So if this was all the simulation was, you could just continue to spread, just like the disease spreading. You could sort of spread, win more hearts and minds by actually rebuilding these things that your country just bombed into oblivion. Then maybe people would be like, okay, well, maybe the bombing was bad, but at least this governor that they've sent to try and rebuild things is okay. Even in Japan, they eventually liked General MacArthur. You can increase, you can build a university, 70% chance of cost overrun, 79% of increasing corruption. This is true as a university employee. Yes, okay, it only costs an extra $2, but there's corruption has gone up, right? So you have decisions like that to make along the way. Where are these insurgents? They're not showing up yet. So I'll wrap this up in a second and bring James up here, but I wanted to show you just briefly what the military aspect of the game looks like, because it's much more, it's more complex with more immediate, I'm getting protests over bad sanitation. I knew I should have bought that toilet icon, right? So what you don't invest in will certainly attract attention as well. Right, so insurgents are preparing to attack. Now I can buy these military options, right? So at the beginning, you only have ability to deploy soldiers from an international force, but basically these are soldiers from abroad, people who are in the militaries of other governments or your own government, and they're being brought in as an occupying force, right? So these are relatively inexpensive, but then as soon as you have those unlocked, you can then train local soldiers as well. And the local soldiers, they stick around permanently. They aren't there for just one tour. But they take a lot longer to train. You can also invest in things like having your military have interpreters and guides to be able to increase local support for them, or surveillance drones and airstrikes. I won't go that far yet, but there's a lot of options that get unlocked. And then, interestingly, so this is something that's very absent from Plague. until their later expansions, is that you have a soldier and you have to decide where to deploy the soldier. I actually haven't had any insurgents attacking yet, but the game really starts to heat up. Okay, there's an insurgent right here, so I'm going to send a soldier over here. And then this soldier is really just going to start shooting. They're going to start shooting at each other. And if I did not deploy a soldier to this area, then they would take over that region, making it resistant to any increase in support from my occupying government. And on top of that, preventing the services that I'm trying to repair from being deployed there. They also sort of move around from region to region and sort of solidify their base. And since they're right next to my home base, you'll see that they've taken over the next province over. And let's see, so more things are happening. There's an aphid infestation, so I have to make a decision here. Maybe the one that has the least chance of having farms collapse. So I provided pesticides. Right, so I'm really having a hard time with just these soldiers. And as you can see, the insurgents are taking over the west side of the map. But now I've got a local soldier as well, so I can deploy them too. So the reason I wanted to show you this is that a lot of the immediate tactics of the game do have to do with trying to figure out how to respond to these insurgents. If you leave them unchecked, then their rebellion basically sort of splits the country eventually into sort of a civil war sort of situation, or drives you out. If you fight them, it's actually also a little bit of a losing battle because they can always fade back into the hills or to neighboring provinces, and you end up having your soldiers try and chase them down, moving from territory to territory, and it's a little bit of a boondoggle from the point of view of like, are we actually effectively? The only way to actually get rid of insurgents is to surround them on all sides. As you can see, there's a lot of different, some of these provinces have many neighboring provinces that the insurgents could escape to. So my interpretation is that's kind of designed to be a little bit like a problem that you can't solve very easily, once again, right? That you can't simply just sort of kill them all and wipe them out. There'll always sort of be a presence. And eventually, when you get towards the latter part of the game, and you've put a lot of military pressure on the insurgents, an option opens up for you to negotiate peace with them. They're only willing to negotiate peace with you if they've been subjected to enough pressure. They won't simply come to the negotiation table. And then there's a long process of making talks where you have to sacrifice some reputation or money or other things in order to try and hammer out a way for the insurgents to be partially or largely represented in the government of the nation, or excluded completely if you have really hammered them very heavily militarily, and so on and so forth. But I won't get into every single small detail of the game, in part because we need to move on. I think we're going to do maybe about 15 minutes. We're going to run a little bit long in this session. But I want to bring James on up to talk a little bit. And I have some questions for him. We'll just leave my game paused here in the background, and then I'll see if you guys have questions as well. So yeah, James, come on down. All right, so so this is James Vaughan, everybody.
Hi, everyone.
The game designer for both of the games that I just talked about. So the first thing I like to ask in these well-play sessions is, like, did I get anything horribly wrong?
No, I mean, I think your strategic choice of attacking them in the mountains was a bold one at the beginning, which meant I
just went straight there. So yeah. you think I should have maybe just let them sit there next to the base?
It's tough to get them out of the mountains unless you've got a lot of military support around the place. Like you're attacking them in the territory that they're most comfortable with. Arguably, you'd have been better placed to stop them capturing the town initially, because every time, if you need to stop them from capturing large-scale population areas, because that's where it does the most damage to your reputation. They gain more support and things like that. So you want to get them out of everywhere, but you've got to pick your battles, especially at the beginning.
You have to pick your battles carefully. Right. So I think the central question here is that the difference here between Plague and Rebel, for me, that really struck me was that, okay, you are on what would traditionally be considered the bad guy side in Plague, right? You're trying to eradicate humanity. But then Rebel Inc., even in the title, it's referring to the insurgents, right? Or you're trying to quash the insurgents.
Yes.
In some ways, like, you could look at it a couple of ways, right? In some ways, you could say, like, well, are we the stormtroopers? Wait, are we the bad guys in this, right? The occupying force, but clearly it's not. Reveling is not one of these games like Oligarchy where you're just trying to understand, or the McDonald's game, where you're like, okay, do you want to understand why this corporation is acting in such evil ways? Well, it's because of this kind of profit incentive, and they try to continue to grow unchecked and so forth. Yeah. The depiction here, I think, is a lot more nuanced, right? Saying like, well, half of the things that you're trying to give money to are about democratic governance, people having a voice, restoring basic services, and growing the economy of this region. But then, like, are we supposed to also be sympathizing with the insurgents, right? In the title,
so
Reveling.
The title is purely a marketing element, to be honest. So we tried various different names. We had Peace Inc. And various other ones. I think Reveling had a certain appeal to it. We wanted to keep the ink there still. So that was mainly to make sure that we can actually get people interested in the game. For the key aim of Reveling is to show people it's not easy. It's not an easy thing. It's not that you get some people thinking, oh, all this shit going on in Afghanistan, just need to send a load more soldiers, bomb them all, have bigger bombs, and it will all be fine, and it will just resolve itself. And you have other people who think, oh, all this military stuff is all evil and is all the problem, and we shouldn't send any soldiers. We should just send aid. And what I wanted to get people to think about with Reveling is actually we don't live in a world that's black and white. It's all a shitty shade of grey. It's all difficult compromises. There's always problems. There's always difficult decisions. It's not easy, and that was the key thing that I wanted to get across with Reveling was having people have to have this balance between, oh, you've got military priorities, you've got civilian priorities, oh, we've got to get people on our side, otherwise we're going to lose too much reputation. But if we don't spend money on military stuff, then the insurgents are going to take over the city, and we'll lose reputation that way, and we're fucked either way. Like, what are we going to do about it? That was the key sort of messages that I wanted people to get from it.
Right. So I was talking at the beginning about the donut hole idea, right? The thing that's missing. And so I'm going to tell you what I think.
On Plaguing, the big one you missed is that the world is it's a flat world. You can't go from Japan to America.
Oh yeah, that's a good point too. I wonder what that says.
And nobody ever notices anything about it.
Right. There's no flights between Los Angeles and Tokyo.
And it doesn't. These kind of things just don't matter. I mean, this actually is some stuff I'll touch on later on this afternoon. But it's the kind of thing that to convey certain messages, you don't have to have everything simulated to the final detail. There's a lot of things you can simplify and ignore even, and they just don't matter if sometimes they actually help people understand the truth of what you're trying to say better.
Yeah, so in some cases that makes total sense. Like you're not going to try to simulate everything, but there's certain things like the question of race in prisons, right? Which I always feel like, okay, choosing to avoid that area, like homelessness in SimCity, that sort of defines a lot of the flavor of the simulation. And so here's what I think, or it struck me as being the thing in Reveling, which is why are you in this situation in the first place, right? That's actually, it seemed like a really striking place to start this simulation, right?
Well, what was interesting actually is that when you were playing the game, you said that you consider yourself to be a Western government.
Right, yeah.
That's, I mean, it's entitled to whoever you want. When designing the game, that was actually something I was quite worried about, sort of saying, oh, here's a Western government here to fix all the problems. That wasn't something we wanted to convey. So actually, in the narrative of the game, you are shown as a local person to this country working with coalition forces outside it. Now, the reality is most people play it and have a view exactly like as you do. Because people, I think, it's easier to associate yourself with the game.
Or if it's
something else,
sort of loosely based on Afghanistan.
Yeah, well, exactly.
Right.
Well, and it is very heavily inspired by Afghanistan.
Yeah.
And the thing which I sat down and when I was looking at this and doing a lot of research and talking to a lot of people is, where did it all go wrong? Well, why is it such a clusterfuck of a situation? I wanted to make Reveling before I set out to make Plaguing, and that was back in 2011. And I thought, oh well, it probably won't be relevant sort of in the future, but actually it's still just as relevant now, if not more so. But I'm entirely forgotten the question.
Right. So the question is, there's the thing that I feel like is maybe haunts Reveling a little bit. is this fact that like you never have any idea of why your country invaded.
Yes.
this
Oh,
other
yeah, exactly.
country
We keep
in the
that
first
all
place.
intact.
Right. It's all happened before the
Yes.
beginning of the game. You're never told.
Yes.
So you don't have any idea of like why people might be mad at you.
Yep.
Well, other than you invaded their country, right?
Mhm. Yep. No, exactly.
Are you invading their country because like there's oil there that you wanted, or because somebody tried to assassinate your daddy?
You don't even know that it was you who invaded the country. You know
Right,
it was
okay.
a war-torn country, and you are there to stabilise
Right.
it.
So it says
We
the
never
invasion is over.
Yes, but we never know who's invaded.
So somebody invaded
Yes,
the country.
Yeah, it's a war-torn country. And that's, I think,
But there's also a rival nation, right? That's
Yes.
supporting insurgents, which
Yes,
is
at
based
least
on the
one.
Soviet Union.
Actually Pakistan.
Pakistan.
Yes.
Oh, okay. I see. Interesting. That makes sense.
Because this is more set in
Right, in the
2002.
2002.
Russia now is being a bit naughty over in Afghanistan as well, but at the time, especially back in that time, it was Pakistan who were and continue to cause some issues. But I think. Yeah, I think it doesn't really matter. Like the games we make, it's about you want to have and it's the same with plaguing. You don't show any gratuitous violence or details. It's like it's a macroeconomic view of the world. With plaguing, it's as if the world is your petri dish, and we take that same kind of logic to Reveling as well. It's top down. You can see clouds. You can't see people. You see clouds when you're playing the game.
You see a machine gun, you hear like a little
noise
from far away.
There's very little elements, but we really try not to have it focus on individual people. We want people to understand the core macroeconomic themes of it. We were talking before this about sort of economics and models and how to help create games through these models. And it's that kind of thing. I want people to be able to see the models and add personal colour and flavour in their own head. So you have added personal flavour. You invaded the country beforehand, so you add these personal things to it, and you can have much more effective colour to the game in your head than I can ever do. And that's why we can get away with quite sort of simple graphics as well. We don't have all sorts of fancy 3D people running around. It's a few flavour images to convey certain things.
Right, and you're never shown anything about like how many people are dying due to these. And that's also a deliberate thing. That's maybe another candidate for like this is the thing that's not present in the simulation that you sort of know. Yeah. You almost anyone would fill that in, right? But it's not part of the simulation.
Yeah, with Reveling there was a very plaguing. People don't seem to really kill the whole world. Yeah, who cares? Doesn't really matter.
Like that one, you actually see like it just ticking up. Like this many hundreds of millions of billions of people have died.
It's a lot more fictitious. Whereas Reveling is. I mean, you've got Afghanistan, you've got Syria, you've got Iraq, or you had Iraq previously. There's a lot of. This is real world serious stuff, and there's a very fine line to kind of cross to make sure we're talking about the issues, but we're not glorifying it, or we're not profiting from suffering. And so, I mean, I reached out to a huge number of people who have spent a lot of time in places like Afghanistan. The Afghan ambassador to the UK, he was very, very helpful, and there's people. I was interested to see how do people who are from Afghanistan who had to flee it or who live there still, how do they feel about the game? And they were all actually very positive about it. Like, oh yes, it's great that people are making games that actually talk about what's going on, because normally you just ignore it. You just push it under. Like when I was doing a lot of research for Reveling, I mean the amount of awful stuff that goes on over there is and you just don't really have an awareness of that normally. And so I didn't. It is a game. People need to enjoy playing it. And again, this is stuff I'll talk about a bit later. But like the game, it's got to be a game first and foremost. So there's a limit to how much of the awfulness you can convey without losing people and stuff. So again, I want people can add that into their head. And you have an event that says, "Oh, you had an airstrike that's killed some civilians." Like you can choose to internally add as much or as little colour as you want.
And there are these moments, I think the airstrikes are interesting in this regard, right? Because that's the moment in which you sort of prod the player a little bit and you say, oh, do you want to relax the rules on the airstrikes so that, they don't cause 45% more civilian deaths.
Or tighten them. And you're I'm fighting if I can't stop the insurgents here, they're going to take over this city of a quarter of the population on the map. Yeah. So actually I can't tighten the rules. We're going to have to accept a certain amount of collateral damage. Imagine having to make that kind of decision. All the decisions are shit. There's no way that you come out of it feeling good. And that's some of the stuff I wanted people to have to think about a little bit. So
here's my last question. So the first time I played it on the easiest mode with the civil servant, right, on the first map.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, I wonder, how much can I get away with not just shooting, having shooting fights across.
So
this
you tried
country.
to go purely for the civilian side.
Yeah, I went so I had one coalition troop. I did have to put them on a second tour of duty, which causes a hurt to your reputation, of course.
Yep.
But I had built enough reputation up that I then just gave concessions in the peace talks to the insurgents all the way down. So I ground my reputation to the ground, but I basically turned the country.
Use that as
I turned the country over to them completely. I gave them everything that they wanted, just to see if it was possible. And it is on that difficulty level. But probably not possible on the harder difficulty
But
levels.
also, you don't have. So it is possible to not sign a peace deal. So some people, I mean, it takes a lot of military action, but it is possible to actually defeat them. So, again, it's a video game. You're going to have people who spend huge amounts of time doing stuff that I didn't think was possible. Well, that's the joy of a kind of an algorithmic game like this, is that all sorts of things which I didn't intend to happen can happen. One of my favourite stories was we had a tester come in, couldn't beat the game, oh, it's impossible, too hard, and he cheated and gave himself a load of extra money. And I've modelled inflation into the game. So inflation went through the roof, and despite giving himself like millions and millions of dollars, he lost the game anyway, because by the end of it he was paying like $10 billion per toilet seat and stuff. And that's a wonderful example of where I think using algorithms in the game, like I'd never intended that to be the case, and yet it happened anyway. And so
the peace talks, when peace is declared, that is a pretty heavy effect on the simulation.
Yes.
Right, which I assume was somewhat deliberate.
You mean when you signed the peace deal?
Once the peace deal is signed, then everything starts to become stable.
Well, and this is again.
So it almost feels like, well, you'd have to really be stubborn.
Once you sign the peace
deal,
signing the peace deal. Once you signed it, you can't really use that. Well, you can if you are quite unlucky.
It basically sort of takes it into an end game. It just rolls all the way to the end.
It is a game, and I think it's got to be an engaging game, it's got to be interesting, and so having a game with a clear end point is important. Like in theory, yes, once you sign the peace deal, you should have another 10 years of sitting there just staring at the map, not really doing much, but that doesn't necessarily make for an engaging game. So that's maybe one of your examples of a donut hole where you have to simplify certain things.
Right, or it has this idea of like, oh, well, once we sign the peace treaty, everything will be fine, when it's maybe not, not that simple.
If would the peace deal even hold, it could collapse again and various other bits.
But again, certain things outside the simulation. So, I'm curious whether any of you have any questions, especially for James. Yeah.
I've noticed that all YouTube made report that they were supposed to tablets and mobile phones. Have you considered expanding to
Oh yes, so Plague Inc. actually is now available on Steam and on console as well, and I've actually made a physical board game version of it. Reveling at the moment is only on mobile and tablet, but we are working on the PC version at the moment. The model that's worked for us with Plague Inc. very well is, I mean, I spend fucking years banging my head against a desk trying to make a good game. So if I've made the game, I want to make sure I can get it out to as many people as possible. So yes, we definitely will be bringing it onto other platforms as well.
So I was thinking about the criticism of the games that Naomi first presented about slavery, and I was wondering if people have criticized you for focusing too much on the macro and not enough on the actual humans, and how you might respond to that.
I've never seen any specific criticism about it. I think we get lots of criticism for lots of reasons, but that's not necessarily one of them. I think it comes down to the kind of game that we're making. I think if you're making we are making a sort of a high level view of a system, and I think that you could jump down to a specific person from it, but I think you then risk kind of like it's two very different. You can make one very good game up here. You'd have to make another very good game down here, and in that case, you're doubling your work effectively. So it's not something I've ever really set out to do. I mean, we do have people asking to see more of what's going on the ground level. So when we did the PC version of Plague Inc., we added in these city cams, which is effectively like a static camera of a picture of a city, and you kind of see the city slowly deteriorating as the disease spreads. So that gave that a little bit. And we do get people asking, well, can you add more? People want to see more of it, but it's not done as a criticism. It's more of they want to see more of their actions. They've got the game gives you a toolbox of things, and you can prod and tweak and play them and see what happens. So people normally want to see a bit more.
Because I can imagine if someone says, oh, black cubes represent slaves, that's terrible. Someone might be like, oh, these random pixels represent people people in horrible poverty.
But interestingly, that's like not, so you don't actually see any people who are getting killed, right? That's maybe, is part of, although I don't know if you've played the Underground Railroad.
No, I'd heard of it before.
But they did have, I think that was part of their challenge, like how much do you show the actual people that are suffering?
But and this was also where I went and spoke to a lot of people in places like Afghanistan to see what do you think about it. Like I spoke to people who are experiencing horrific things very regularly, and you say to them, "Oh, what do you think about somebody making a game about this?" And I was expecting to have a bit of a cross section of some people saying, "Oh no, this isn't appropriate for a game," and other people saying, "Yes, it's good." But it was uniformly positive. Like people, I think probably it's a very bad situation, but it's much better, I think, to have somebody talking about the situation rather than ignoring it, which is what happens almost all the time, is that just because people don't talk, it's better to talk about it than not. If you don't talk about it, the awful things are still happening.
I think that Flight to Freedom game is such an interesting example too, because that's trying to be like, oh, let's zoom all the way down to like one person. And the thing that they ran into was like having these choices, like, oh, white man stops you on the road. It's like, do you act subservient towards the white man,
a lot harder to
or
do
rebellious?
It at that kind of level. And
the correct answer is to be subservient, so that he'll like let you go, right? But especially in an educational game, that's like a hard thing to be like, well, you should have been subservient to that white man.
And when you're at a high level, like again, people can place their own interpretations on it, and so people can fit it with their own views and expectations in a way. You're not forcing a particular narrative as much as you are when you zoom right down. Question at the end.
One of those interesting things I've just heard here is this concept of donut holes in simulation. You obviously can't do, as you pointed out, you can't do everything. You can't simulate everything. How, as a game designer, do you manage that? Do you think about that trade-off between the donut holes you've got to accept and game mechanics to make it physically engaging as a participatory entertainment?
I mean, everyone's probably got a different way, but for me, it's lots of pain and suffering, and kind of it's keeping it's iteration. It's constant iteration. So with Reveling, I had a big list of things and mechanics that I wanted to try and get in some way. I want to have corruption. Here's a very important thing. I want to have a peace process. I want to have inflation. I want to have this military-civilian pull. But then it's trying so many different ways to fit these concepts. There's infinite different ways they can be put in the game and have different effects and stuff, and it's 2 years of sitting in a room banging my head against a desk and sort of taking what comes out of my ears and scooping it into the computer.
So when did you think about the donut holes?
Oh no, it happens naturally. But for me, the game, the focus is it's got to be a fun game. I am here to make a game that is enjoyable, and so I'm trying all these different things, and I'm just naturally things will drop out, or I'll change them, or we'll try tweaking something, or I'll think, oh yeah, that's perfect, and then 2 months later I'll think, oh actually that's shit. Let's try something else and change it. It's a bit like you've got a clockwork mechanism, and you've got to use your mind to lift it up and take it all apart and change a few bits and pieces, put it all back, and it's got to work or not. Because with the problem with a model like this is there's so many different elements, you don't know if it's going to work or not until it's all done. And so the game was shit pretty much up until launch, and then you're kind of there just. I mean, the key mechanism that I wanted to have in the game from 2011 was the kind of the feeling of cat and mouse, where you've got some insurgents, and you'd put a soldier there, and the soldier would win. And the insurgents would just go next door, and in fact you couldn't like just fight them. And we get people sending in emails and stuff saying, "Oh, this is so unfair and unbalanced. I'm beating the insurgents," and yet they just keep moving to the next zone. And I'm like, "Yep, that's real life for you."
And it's very, very rarely ever been done in a game, right? The usual way that combat is portrayed in the game, military conflict, is like, okay, well you beat them, and then they're gone. Right, or they surrendered.
Well, what gave me the idea with this is there's a variant you can play on a chessboard which is called cat and mouse. I mean, not many people seem to have heard of it, so I don't know if it's an official one or not. But where you have got one player who's got 5 pieces and the other's got 1, and you're trying to
fox and geese or toffle or similar games.
But yeah, and that was the key sort of guiding star from 2011 all the way through to Reveling was I want to have that kind of
yeah, that's great. I mean, those are the earliest asymmetrical games, or that genre of board game. And of course, this is a very asymmetrical warfare that you're portraying here, so it makes sense. Yeah. I have one other perspective on the donut hole thing, since I'm the one who brought it up. sometimes it's you make a model and there's just part of the model that you can't also loop in because it will make everything break, or that you're not. For some designers, I think sometimes it results from a blind spot or something that you don't want to simulate. But there is a practice, I think, especially from the role-playing game community, that they call over there the fruitful void is their way of referring to the donut hole. And the idea there is that you need the players to bring some of their own ideas and interpretation to the simulation, to whatever's being simulated, and that you shouldn't try to legislate everything with the rules or the model. You have to leave a gap there, right? So the examples are in things like Dogs in the Vineyard is a game about teenage Mormon circuit judge executioners, weird premise like back in the 19th century. But what exactly constitutes the faith of these characters is not described in the rule book, right? It's actually left for the players to interpret, right? Or games like Monster Hearts are about teenage monsters having bad relationships with each other, but exactly there are no rules about sexual orientation or sexuality, right? It's left entirely up to the players to decide. And for both of those designers, Davidson, Baker, and Avery Alder, they kind of leave that as a gap there because they're like, actually, we need the players to bring that part of it. Just like batteries not included, right? And I use this in my own games as well. My game Consentical, there's no rules about here's how you have to do consent, right? The players have to bring that. And so I think actually the thing that corresponds in what you were talking about is saying well, there's certain things that the player is just going to have to imagine or understand, what the consequences of their actions are, what it means that they're here, how they might have gotten there in the first place.
Yep.
Right? Who am I exactly? It's never quite answered, right? Am I a regional governor? Well, no, I can't.
And we made a conscious decision we're not gonna define it.
Right, exactly. So that undefined part, and choosing what to leave undefined, where you want the player to step into the breach, because there has to be some room for the player. It's like having the space for the pilot to sit in a vehicle, right? And so that maybe corresponds in a lot of these cases to the donut hole. Let's see.
I'm curious how you balance kind of the needs of the serious topic that you're addressing with, as you said a number of times, that you're making a game. Because there's a tension in you're systematizing a real thing that exists and making it solvable, right? You can win.
Yeah, making it winnable is a massive donut hole in itself.
Not something you can do in real life.
Yeah.
Many people would argue. So I guess because you're in essence making an argument almost about how we should be in policy.
Yes.
So I was curious what your kind of process was like for that.
A huge amount of research, basically, just finding out where, and talking to people who know a lot more about it, where do you think it went wrong? What do you think should have been done differently? If you could go back in time, what would happen? And things like corruption is a massive example of where not enough was done about that, and you could argue it's still not. There's a cigar report, the Attorney General for Afghanistan's reconstruction, and they're done every quarter, and the corruption that they uncover and regularly is just disgusting, and the amount of money that's wasted, and yet arguably in the very beginning, corruption was treated as a natural thing to be accepted. So it's basically lots and lots of research and an acceptance that it does have to be winnable. So then it's finding out where are we going to suspend realism, and the peace process is actually a key part of that, because I wanted to have that in there anyway, but it was a case of, okay, right, we're going to have the peace process, and then do we make people keep on playing for a long time? No, actually, because that was boring, so we cut it down and we have this artificial. It's a similar kind of thing when you're on plague, when your disease is cured. As soon as the disease is cured, this miraculous distribution system manufactures and distributes the cure to everyone around the world in about a month. Amazing, miracle.
It's a bit like deciding where you're going to end a story, right? Because that's always artificial as well. There's something else that's going to happen afterwards, and it won't be a happy ending after all.
And my model, right? So we've had some people play it for I think 500 years in Reveling. My model is guaranteed until for about 12 to 15 years, and after that, all warranties are off.
Wow.
So you get some rather weird behaviour happening after that. But so it has to be a fun game. That is the overarching thing on it. And there was a concern: could we make it? Could we make a fun game while still being respectful of the subject matter and being something that we were proud to put our name on? And if we hadn't been able to do that, we would have chucked it. We're in a very lucky position that we don't have the financial constraints that a lot of game studios would have. So it was the case of, from the very beginning, we always said, it's got to be perfect. It's got to be a great game, and it's got to be something we'll have to put our name to. Otherwise, we won't go with that.
I think we've got time for one more question over here.
First of all, I think both games, I think
Thank you.
on note.
Very good.
I'd be interested to know just how commercially successful they've been. And,
So we've got 120 million players around the world. So we've been.
Is that on Rebel or?
No, Reveling's. I mean, Reveling. We've got 4 million plus players on Reveling. Plague Inc. is unique in how well it's done. It's one of the most popular premium mobile games ever. You've got Minecraft, which is obviously in a league of its own, and then we're probably second or third after that. So it's a niche. We are operating in a very definite niche, but it is a very it's a very profitable niche. As long as for a small company that can keep costs down, it's great. You're going to see Epic stop making Fortnite and start making Reveling 2. Probably not. They might pay for their lunch for a day, and that's about it. Yes, you absolutely. That's my joke for my talk later on. Like, now you've ruined it.
All right. If you guys have further questions, it's now lunch. So
I'll hang around for a bit.
Yeah, feel free to come up and chat. Thank you guys so much for coming to the talk.